By the 1950s, the Soviet Union appeared powerful. It possessed a massive army, had nuclear weapons, and controlled half of Europe. But beneath the surface, the USSR was already showing signs of slow decline. Harsh political realities and deep economic problems would shape the next decades of the Cold War. In 1953, the Soviet Union entered a period of uncertainty when Joseph Stalin died after nearly 3 decades of ruthless rule. Stalin left behind a legacy of fear, repression, and immense human suffering, but he did not leave a clear successor. As a result, a bitter power struggle erupted among the top leaders of the Communist Party as each sought to claim control of the Soviet state. After several years of political maneuvering, Nikita Khrushchev emerged as the dominant leader. Khrushchev inherited a nation that appeared powerful on the surface but was facing deep problems beneath. Unlike Stalin, he recognized that the communist system was not living up to its promises. Communist ideology had claimed that it would create a workers' paradise, a classless society where ordinary people would enjoy prosperity, equality, and freedom from exploitation. Yet the reality was very different. Instead of empowering workers, the Communist Party controlled nearly every aspect of people's lives. Citizens had little freedom to speak, write, or criticize the government. Consumer goods were often scarce, and the products that were available were frequently inferior to those found in the West. Perhaps most troubling, millions of people were voting with their feet, leaving the Communist East whenever they could in search of better opportunities and greater freedom in the capitalist West. By the mid-1950s, it was becoming increasingly clear that communism was failing to attract the very workers it claimed to represent. Rather than building a model society, the Soviet system was struggling to keep its people from leaving. Khrushchev understood that if the Soviet Union was to survive and compete with the West, significant changes would be necessary. Something had to change. In February 1956, Nikita Khrushchev took a dramatic step that stunned the Soviet leadership and changed the course of Soviet history. Speaking at a closed session of the 20th Communist Party Congress, Khrushchev delivered a speech that openly attacked the legacy of Joseph Stalin. He denounced Stalin as a tyrant and a murderer, condemned the mass purges that had led to the imprisonment and execution of millions, and argued that Stalin's brutality had weakened the Soviet Union and nearly brought disaster during World War II. The speech, which became known as the secret speech, shocked party members who had spent years praising Stalin as an infallible leader. For the first time, a Soviet leader publicly acknowledged many of the crimes committed under Stalin's rule. Khrushchev hoped that exposing these abuses would strengthen the Soviet system by distancing it from the terror and repression of the past. The secret speech marked the beginning of a new policy known as de-Stalinization. Through this effort, Khrushchev sought to reduce the atmosphere of fear that had dominated Soviet life, release many political prisoners, and signal that communism would move in a different direction. While Khrushchev did not reject communism itself, he promised that the Soviet Union would no longer rely on the extreme methods that had characterized Stalin's rule. For many people in the USSR and across Eastern Europe, the speech raised hopes that a more open and humane era was beginning. Khrushchev also sought to address the Soviet Union's growing economic problems. He argued that the USSR had spent too many resources on heavy industry, military production, and the arms race with the West. To prove that communism could provide a better life for ordinary people, he wanted the government to place greater emphasis on producing consumer goods such as clothing, household appliances, and other everyday products. Khrushchev believed that improving living standards would strengthen public support for the Soviet system and demonstrate the superiority of communism over capitalism. Yet, Khrushchev quickly ran into a fundamental problem. The Soviet economy was a command economy, meaning that every major economic decision was controlled by the state. Government officials determined what factories would produce, how much they would produce, and where resources would be allocated. Because economic decisions were tied directly to the political system, meaningful economic reform required changes in the way the government operated. This created a major contradiction in Khrushchev's policies. He wanted better economic results and greater efficiency, but he was unwilling to loosen the Communist Party's monopoly on power. The same centralized bureaucracy that had created many of the Soviet Union's economic problems remained firmly in control. As a result, attempts to increase the production of consumer goods and improve living standards were limited by the rigid political system. Khrushchev hoped to modernize communism without changing its basic structure. He wanted reform, but only to a point. While he criticized Stalin's excesses and promised a more humane system, he had no intention of allowing political freedom or reducing the Communist Party's authority. Consequently, many of the Soviet Union's underlying problems remained unresolved, and Khrushchev's economic reforms produced only mixed results. Khrushchev soon discovered that improving life in the Soviet Union was far more difficult than criticizing Stalin. The Soviet economy simply was not strong enough to achieve all of the goals he envisioned. On one hand, he wanted to increase the production of consumer goods and raise living standards for ordinary citizens. On the other hand, he remained committed to competing with the United States in the Cold War, a rivalry that demanded enormous military spending. This created a serious dilemma. The Soviet Union lacked the economic resources to both provide abundant consumer goods and maintain military strength equal to that of the West. Factories, raw materials, and government funding had to be directed somewhere, and Khrushchev consistently chose to continue the struggle against the United States. Vast amounts of money and labor were devoted to weapons production, the armed forces, and technological competition, leaving fewer resources available for housing, consumer products, and other domestic needs. As a result, the promises of economic reform were difficult to fulfill. While Khrushchev spoke of improving everyday life, the demands of the Cold War continued to take priority. The Soviet economy remained burdened by inefficiency, shortages, and central planning, and many of the improvements Khrushchev hoped to achieve never fully materialized. By the late 1950s, it was becoming clear that Khrushchev faced a fundamental problem. He wanted the Soviet Union to compete with the West abroad while simultaneously raising living standards at home. But the Soviet system lacked the resources and flexibility to accomplish both goals. Consequently, his reform efforts began to stall almost as soon as they started, revealing the deep structural weaknesses that continued to plague the communist system. Khrushchev's secret speech and his policy of de-Stalinization had consequences far beyond the Soviet Union itself. Across Eastern Europe, many people interpreted his criticism of Stalin as a sign that meaningful political change was finally possible. If Moscow now admitted that Stalin had ruled through terror and repression, perhaps the Soviet grip on its satellite states was beginning to weaken as well. These hopes quickly sparked unrest throughout the Soviet bloc, leading to two major crises in 1956. In Poland, growing frustration with Soviet domination led to widespread protests and demands for reform. Polish leaders pushed for greater national independence and more control over their own affairs. Faced with the possibility of a larger rebellion, Khrushchev chose a more flexible approach. Rather than sending in Soviet troops, he negotiated a compromise with the Polish government. Poland was granted limited autonomy and allowed to pursue some reforms, but it remained firmly within the communist system and the Soviet sphere of influence. Just months later, a far more serious challenge emerged in Hungary. What began as demonstrations for reform quickly developed into a full-scale revolution. Hungarian protesters demanded an end to communist rule, withdrawal from the Soviet-controlled system, and genuine national independence. Unlike the situation in Poland, these demands threatened the very foundation of Soviet control in Eastern Europe. Khrushchev was unwilling to allow a communist country to leave the Soviet camp. Determined to preserve Soviet authority, he ordered the Red Army into Budapest. Soviet tanks rolled into the Hungarian capital, and fierce street fighting erupted between Soviet forces and Hungarian revolutionaries. For more than a week, the city became a battlefield. Thousands of people were killed before Soviet troops finally crushed the uprising and restored communist control. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 revealed the limits of Khrushchev's reforms. While he was willing to criticize Stalin and make modest changes within the Soviet system, he would not tolerate challenges to Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. The message was clear. Communist governments in the region would remain in power, and if necessary, Soviet military force would ensure their survival. The suppression of the Hungarian Revolution also damaged Khrushchev's credibility. Many people who had hoped de-Stalinization would bring greater freedom now realized that the Soviet Union remained committed to maintaining its empire by force. Although Khrushchev promised a new era, the events in Hungary demonstrated that the basic realities of Soviet control had not changed. Despite his early efforts at reform, Khrushchev proved unable to solve the Soviet Union's most serious economic problems. By the early 1960s, many of the issues he had hoped to address remained unresolved. Consumer goods were still in short supply, leaving ordinary citizens frustrated by long lines and limited choices. Agricultural production repeatedly fell short of expectations despite ambitious government programs, forcing the Soviet Union to import grain from abroad. At the same time, the costs of maintaining military parity with the United States continued to rise, placing even greater strain on the economy. As economic difficulties persisted, dissatisfaction with Khrushchev grew within the Communist Party. Many officials viewed his policies as inconsistent and disruptive, while others believed his reforms had produced few meaningful results. Although Khrushchev had promised to modernize the Soviet system, he had failed to overcome the structural weaknesses of the command economy or improve living standards to the extent he had promised. In October 1964, a group of Communist Party leaders removed Khrushchev from power in a bloodless political coup. Unlike many Soviet leaders who had fallen from power under Stalin, Khrushchev was not imprisoned or executed. Instead, he was quietly forced into retirement. He was replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, who quickly moved to reverse many of Khrushchev's reforms and restore greater stability and control within the Soviet system. Brezhnev's rise marked the beginning of a new era in Soviet history. Rather than pursuing major reforms, his government emphasized stability, hierarchy, and the preservation of the existing system. While this approach reduced the political turmoil that had characterized Khrushchev's leadership, it did little to address the Soviet Union's underlying economic and social problems. Over time, economic growth slowed, innovation declined, and the communist system became increasingly rigid. Historians refer to this period as the era of stagnation, a long phase of economic and political decline that would contribute to the Soviet Union's eventual collapse in 1991.